All right, do you think we should kick things off? We'll keep admitting people as they roll in.
Good.
All right, thanks. Thank you all for coming here today and joining us. It's 5:30 on a Thursday. I hope you have a nice beverage that makes you happy in front of you. I'm Melanie Starkey. I am Vice President for Digital Marketing at the Urban Land Institute. I'm also very lucky to be on the leadership team of ComNetworkDC. So that's the Washington Region chapter of the Communications Network. Today's program is about racial equity and about what you can be doing yourself, no matter what your position of power. Everybody has a position of power, and what resources are available to you. I am so grateful for you all to be here today, and so grateful for our panelists who are going to be speaking with us today. We have Tamara Lucas Copeland, who is the trustee at the Weisberg Foundation. She's also the former president of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. You're going to hear a lot more about RAG in a minute. We also have Nina Weisberg, trustee of the Weisberg Foundation and CEO of a family real estate company that's based here in the DC region. And we have Hanh Lee, executive director of the Weisberg Foundation and a member of the RAG board of directors. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just so everybody knows, because I'm sure we have people here today who have not been involved with the communications network before. ComNet is a group, a membership organization for people who are in communications for social good organizations. So many of us work for foundations. I work for a nonprofit and membership association with a mission-based work. We also have people who work for agencies who do social good work. And we do have some people in the media. All are welcome to our programming. We're so glad to see you. Here in DC, we have been striving in these exceptional times to have a program about once a month. And we're really glad that you're able to join us today. One of the reasons I fell in love with ComNet just a year ago when I got introduced to the organization is it's a gathering organization, and it's a place that really creates personal relationships. So I invite all of you to turn your cameras on today. Today is a conversation. You know, normal Zoom etiquette, if you can mute yourself when you're not speaking, that's really helpful for everybody's experience. But please do unmute and ask questions, and use the group chat to ask questions as well. We're not going to do a formal Q&A at the end. We're going to do Q&A as we move along in this program, and we're here to help you. And so if we're not answering your questions, then we're not helping you in the ways that you need. So just raise your hand and let us know what's going on. We're happy to take questions all along. And then if you could, it would be amazing if you could use chat right now to introduce yourself, maybe what organization you're affiliated with, say hi to all of us, and let us know what you're hoping to get out of today's program. So thank you very much. A couple things that I wanted to let you know are available to you is the Crisis Comms Triage Kit. So, you know, for those of you who are in communications, and I imagine it's most of you, you know, these have been very difficult times, obviously, and, you know, from COVID to all kinds of things that are happening in the world, the Communications Network has gathered best practices, has gathered examples that you can borrow from, and as well as just talk to members. So I've popped in the chat the link to get to the Triage Kit. It has all kinds of things in there that are helpful assets to you, so you don't have to start from scratch and feel like you're going through this alone. We also have coming up ComNetwork Virtual. So like I said, I fell in love with ComNet a year ago. It's because I went to the annual live event. It was in Austin. Sadly, we will not be able to have our event live in Atlanta as we planned, but we will be holding it virtually. And I wanted to let you know that it is free to attend this year. There is no charge to ComNet. We are not taking any kind of registration for the 3-day version. It's 3 days full of great online virtual programming and gathering. We do ask that you make a donation to a non-government organization of your choice in Atlanta, because Atlanta was our original host city, but we will not be taking any revenue from that for ComNet. But we are offering an extended version. It lasts from September 14th to the beginning of December. It's a small group of people who will be engaging in the issues that we will talk about in the 3-day ComNet presentation and virtual conference. It's limited in the number of seats. It is a paid registration, and registration is coming up soon. I hate to say this, it's nearly August, and registration ends, I think that's August 3rd. So that's sooner than we all think. All right, so what are we gonna go over today? One thing that we'd like some help with is planning our agenda for next month. During these times of social isolation, storytelling has become difficult for communications teams. You can't just send a video crew out to a site to effectively tell the story that you want. So also in the chat, we'd love to hear from you some ideas about alternative storytelling media that you are using, or great examples that you're seeing out in the field. We want to get together a dynamic group of panelists to talk about what we might do that isn't just video crews having to fly far away to destinations. We know you all are doing great work out there, and we'd love to share it. So you can pop that into the chat as well. And then our program will formally kick off with talking about putting racism on the table. I'll get back to that in a minute. And then we'll talk about, among us, what are our roles that we can play in social change. We'll do some breakout sessions so you all have an opportunity to get to know each other in small groups and talk about this issue. And then we're going to talk about, okay, how do we go from these big picture ideas? How do we go from learning about the structural context of racism in America? And how do we go to strategy and then operations? We'll be hearing from Hanh about that particularly. And then we'll talk about making some authentic and sustained commitments to racial equity. We'll talk about what we mean by that and talk about what we ourselves can be doing in the next few months so that we can keep the racial equity on the table. Sound good to everyone? All right. So our panelists again, I'm so excited to see them. We have Tamara, we have Nina, we have Hanh. I'm going to start with Tamara. Tamara, putting racism on the table is an incredible free product that is available to everybody today on this call. You are the creator of that. It includes videos with amazing speakers such as Dr. Ibram Kendi. It includes discussion guides to talk to your colleagues or other people in your life about what you just saw and processing what it means to you. There are podcasts. There are great examples of what other groups have done in applying putting racism on the table to their own work. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the program, how it came to be?
Yeah, thank you, Melanie, for this opportunity.
Thank you.
You know, it started with Freddie Gray, and I suspect that many folks will remember that he died as a result of his injuries in a police vehicle in Baltimore. And some of the CEOs of the RAG member organizations started calling me and saying, can that happen here? What should we do? And I didn't have an answer and invited them to come and talk about this problem as well as what possible solutions there were. And we had about 12 or 15 people around a conference room table. And they started talking about interventions, and they talked about lead-based paint and education opportunities in the healthcare system. And then suddenly somebody realized that they were saying all the things that philanthropy always says. There were no new interventions being described. And it came about that the relationship between race and some of the problems that we were seeing across the country, because this was, I suspect, the beginning of all the cell phone videos. This was 2015. So we were getting cell phone videos from across the country. And someone had a great quote, and the quote was from John Gardner, who founded Independent Sector. And the quote is, "The first step in leadership is not action, it's understanding." And Melanie, that was powerful. It was powerful in helping us know that what we needed to focus on was education. And that's when we came up with the 6-part learning series. And when we talked about it and people said, well, what's the goal? What do you want to have happen because of it? And our goal was simply enhanced understanding, knowledge and enhanced understanding. And hopefully that would lead to behavior change. But we knew there would be no behavior change until there was enhanced knowledge.
Yeah, I know you've talked a little bit about the importance of the viewing the videos and the work from the very beginning to the end, because it was intentionally curated with a particular order. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there really was an arc to it. And we intentionally called it racism, putting racism on the table, because we wanted people to understand how embedded institutional racism is, structural racism is in our society. So we started with a conversation about that. We invited John Powell to come and talk about structural racism. Then we had a name that I know a lot of people are hearing now, Robin DiAngelo, and she's the author of White Fragility. And Robin talked about white privilege. And on the screen now you see the series of speakers. So structural racism, white privilege, implicit bias. And then the fourth speaker is actually James Bell, and he was to offer a case study, because what we wanted the audience to see was how structural racism, white privilege, and implicit bias interact in any system. And we chose the system of mass incarceration. He was the fourth. Then Manuel Pastor talked about the racial mosaic of America, because the other three speakers had truly been focused on the dynamic between the white community and the Black community, and somewhat on racism that started in slavery and continued through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, et cetera. We wanted to have Manuel Pastor to talk about, just as I said, the racial mosaic of America and the fact that that's not only between the Black community and the white community. And lastly, we wanted to bring it back to the philanthropic community, because the intent was to talk about what philanthropy could do and should do. And that's when we had Gail Christopher, who at the time was at the Kellogg Foundation.
Yeah, and hopefully you all can see my screen. I have the website up. I believe it's correct that the series was actually developed as in-person events over 6 months, one per month.
That's exactly
specifically for CEOs and trustees in foundations.
That's correct. The notion was that we needed to have the folks at the top to buy into this, to see their role in addressing this problem, and felt that that we wanted to have CEOs and trustees. But we immediately got pushback, and that was great, because we got pushback from staffs of foundations who said, well, what about us? And because we were still intent on focusing on CEOs and on trustees, but because of the pushback, we videotaped each session. We didn't videotape the interaction. So there was a 3-hour session. The first hour was a lecture by the folks on the screen. And then there was a 2-hour facilitated conversation that was done at each table. There were tables of 6. And so there were prompting questions at each table. So we didn't videotape the interaction at the tables, but did videotape all of the presentations. And that was truly pivotal in getting the series the kind of attention that it received, not only in the local philanthropic community, but also across the country.
And Nina, you were, go ahead. Yeah,
we had only done 2 sessions. I think we had gotten into the second one when people said, I got it. You know, what am I going to do? What am I supposed to do? And so I think that's important to say, because everyone wants to act. But to go back to the John Gardner quote, you know, the first step in leadership is not action, it's understanding. And so we were focused on going through those 6 sessions, which we did. But then we also announced, I think at the 3rd session, we announced a series of kind of practicums. We had 3 sessions that started in, I think, August. We had 3 sessions on grant making with a racial equity lens, and then 2 additional sessions that were on communications that were open to the entire philanthropic community.
Yeah. Show of hands with the reaction button or in the chat. How many of you have personally felt like you needed to rush straight into action, or have heard that from your colleagues? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads.
We see the problem and we want to do something about it. Our belief, however, was that we didn't fully understand the problem. Mm-hmm. And that until we dug deeply and had a stronger sense of the structures that were in place that, like I said, we would end up with interventions that were focused on symptoms and not focused on addressing the problems.
Yeah. And Nina, you were in that original 2016 cohort.
I was, yeah.
Yeah. Representing the Weisberg Foundation. How did it get on your radar?
You know, I was trying to remember that today for this talk. I have no idea. Honestly, except I was craving it. I mean, the minute I saw it, I knew I was going to go. And I can't remember how I heard about it. But I wanted to say, you know, Tamara's emphasis on learning, for me at that moment in time, this is January 2016, this is a while ago. I wanted to talk about how race was affecting what we were trying to do at the foundation, but I had no idea how to engage in that conversation. It was prohibited. You know, it was like you didn't say these words. There was no language at the time that I felt comfortable with using and that I felt there was a shared understanding of. And so, you know, you talk about things that are transformative in your life, and this series was for me very much transformative in terms of the work we do in the foundation, but also in all areas of my life and how I saw myself as an influencer and as someone who could translate or create change. It gave me the very beginning of language for how to talk about these things in the variety of spaces that I was in, instead of feeling like, that's not right, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what the structures were that I were reacting to. I didn't know what the language was that I was reacting to. This was my intro into being able to make more sense of that. And I'm still working on that. I don't think we'll ever be done working on that, but this was my deep embeddedness. And I wanted to say something else that I thought Tamara was really brilliant about in terms of pulling this together. I didn't have a chance in my world to sit with the other trustees and CEOs of all of these various organizations. And so by making it exclusive to us, which was, you know, it made the barrier high, so we came, but it also gave us time in these very intimate groups to talk about what was complicated in the work we did across a variety of organizations that work on health. There were people from the banking industry there, and I met the heads of a lot of other foundations and trustees that I just didn't have any, if I knew them, I didn't know them with this level prior to this work.
Mm-hmm.
Nina, I'm glad you talked to you, that you made the comment about normalizing a conversation, because that was a key part of it.
Yeah. I didn't feel like I could say the word black. Was it black? Was it African American? Would I trip over it? Like, I couldn't say those words in a public place. Because I felt that they had meaning that I didn't understand, and therefore I wasn't empowered to even use those words to say white, to say black, to name race. Yeah.
Well, here's a good question from Alex McLennan at the World Wildlife Fund. So how would you convince your leadership or your staff, you know, it can come at all levels, right? How would you convince them to take the time to really slow down and learn before jumping into communicating? Because I see from the nodding of heads that many of us are feeling that pressure.
Well, I think there's a level of discipline. You know, that there are a lot of folks out there now because of the reality of George Floyd's murder, and people are talking about chokeholds and banning chokeholds in police departments, and that's critically important. But there are so many layers of what needs to happen in the criminal justice system and the policing system in our country that go well beyond chokeholds. And I think that might be an example I would give as to why we needed to learn, why we needed to watch 13, why we needed to read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, why we needed to investigate what's really going on. I have a colleague who does implicit bias training for police departments and commented to me that there are jurisdictions in the area who can say that they have had the training, but people walk out of it. Police officers will walk out of the training or will read other books during the training. So we have to be able to constantly peel back that onion and really get a clear sense of what the problems are before we try to respond.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly powerful. And we went on from putting racism on the table to expanding the table. Tamara also visioned and led with Washington leadership that was open to staff and other people, and to how do we talk about racism in the region, which was a working group that was open to all of the members of RAG. And 2 years in with community conversations, like these aren't, one training doesn't give you the understanding of your own individual bias or of the structures that exist. That said, you also can't sit on the sidelines forever. To Tamara's point about the chokeholds and making systematic change, I am also, and we had this conversation prior to this panel, hearing about people who are passing policy in Maryland or Virginia about chokeholds, but unwilling to look at policing in schools, which is where these things begin to build up in very early years, or over-policing in communities. Some of the bigger issues that lead to the outcomes of which chokeholds is one symptom. So many ways, and as Tamara said, we need to be looking at the roots and not just some of the outcomes.
And I'll just jump in and say another benefit of, and I agree with Nina as well, that we can't sit on the sidelines forever. At some point, we do need to act, right? But there's so many good intentions in this work. And when you don't truly have the historical context and the structural analysis and understand kind of the personal aspect of it as well, you could actually do a lot of harm, right? Both to other individuals as well as to kind of the larger work that you're trying to do. And so we don't want to, in doing and learning about racial equity and advancing racial equity and doing racial justice work, we don't want to perpetuate the racial trauma, right, of people of color and communities of color. So it's like we have to be really careful to tend to kind of the impact of what we're doing, not just the good intentions.
Yeah, I'm so glad you added that. And, you know, Hanh, you're an executive director at an organization. Like, how do you have those hard conversations with somebody who's not quite there yet in understanding that?
That's, you know, it's so funny. It isn't funny. It's very real, right? But it happens all the time. And so a big part of this work is just like Tamara was saying, you have to name it. You know, you have to name racism, and you have to be able to, and Robin DiAngelo does a great job of this, like not, and Imran Kendi, it's like, it's not that, you know, instead of attacking the person and their wholeness and saying they are a racist, kind of bracket it and be like, let's pause. I feel like what was said there felt racist, or it might cause harm, or was a microaggression. So you need to address it in the moment and explain, right? And then hopefully then you can, like, through multiple times of doing this, you can transform someone's understanding and knowledge and behavior. But it is important to be really intentional in speaking to it and thinking about when it's appropriate to call someone in. And sometimes it might be appropriate to call someone out as well, right? But just developing that muscle so that you can do it with less fear, right, of what might happen, because it's more about what's going to happen if you don't do it.
You said call someone in versus call someone out. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. And this is something that I'm working on, right, is that when someone says something that you're like, my initial reaction is like, whoa, that was not appropriate, or that's racist, or that person, you know, doesn't know what they're talking about. It's like, well, one, don't, you know, just enter it with curiosity, right? Like, one, because like you give the person the benefit of the doubt, right? And two, they're more likely to engage with you if you enter with curiosity, right? And then also, I'll say, as a person of color, when someone says something inappropriate, I want to put the burden on them to kind of explain why they said or did what they did, right? Instead of taking it out on myself. So if someone says something, I'd be like, oh, wait, help me understand, you know, why you framed that in that way, or why you went there with that conversation, or why you did that. Help me understand. So entering into conversation, like entering it with curiosity, is really helpful for both you and the person you're talking to, because there is learning on both sides of that. So that's more like calling someone in, because oftentimes when we call people out, they shut down and they're not going to engage, and then that's a lost opportunity for learning and transformation.
That is a real skill, I think, that I need to build more. Go ahead, Nina.
Yeah, forever working on it. I think not expert is all I want to say about all of these things for me. But I did want to put in parallel with what Hanh just said, that a lot of the sessions, just to go back to putting racism on the table, the vast majority of the sessions were more about the structures as opposed to the individuals. And for me, that was a really helpful way into this conversation. And it's given me a lot of examples to draw from. And Tamara, I was re-listening to some of these for this panel. I draw from these examples all the time because they're so non-individual. There was an example for how street light repairs are reported in one of the talks. And it was, how does structural racism work in community government? And so street lights are repaired, and it's true in Arlington. I think it is still true because people phone and say this street light is out. If you're a community that doesn't feel empowered to phone your local government and say your street lights are out, then you're going to end up with a lot of street lights out. And if you have a lot of street lights out, you have an increase in crime and danger. So that's a situation that has a built-in structure that assumes that the people in the community are empowered enough to phone the government. I thought that was such a brilliant example. It was so depersonalized. So when you're speaking to someone who discounts structural racism and you give them, and there's a lot more background on that example that I won't go into, like how they figured it out, which I thought was brilliant. But for me, that one is such a great starter when you're in conversation with people who don't want to believe that there are structures that are unintentionally, very unintentionally, but they're built into our systems that empower people that are already empowered and disempower people that aren't empowered. And some of those are very intentional, like redlining, and some of those are somewhat accidental, like the streetlight example, which I think isn't accidental when you think about the fact that government was built and who built it and who is assumed votes and all the rest of it. But still, it is built into the system in a way that wasn't, didn't intend harm, to use Han's example of coming to the conversation with sympathy, didn't intend harm.
Great question right now from Sarah Veldkamp. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Sarah. At what point do we stop catering to white comfort in these conversations? Love to hear your perspectives on that.
Tamara?
Well, I was actually waiting for Hanh. I thought that, well, and this is why. I think that Hanh has a lot of experience working with the Racial Equity Working Group. And how do you do that? I do think there's a fine line in making sure that you do exactly what Hanh said about bringing people in. That it's never, I don't think there's value in making someone feel uncomfortable. That's personally, I just don't think there's value. That being said, I made myself a commitment to me that I will not be in a situation where I feel that someone has made a comment or done an action that is racially based, that I don't say something about it. And I will try to be as elegant as Hanh always is in the manner in which I do that. But I am committed to addressing the situation in a way that I think I wasn't some years ago.
Oh, and I think Tamara, you do it so with such skill and grace that I, like look up to you. And yeah, so Tamara mentioned our racial equity working group was kind of coming out of the Putting Racism on the Series Putting Racism on the Table learning series. Okay, now how are we gonna act? What do we want to do, right? What is the change we want to create actually to build this racially equitable region? And that was a multiracial space, right, of funders, from different foundations, different races, different levels of positionality in their organizations. And so, of course, there's a lot of dynamics that you're working through. And I think one of the things we learned early on is like, we needed to build trust within that group right? So that we could have those tough conversations, not just about the work, but how we engage with each other, right? And also have some clarity on like, what are our goals as a working group? Like, what are we here to do? And what do we all agree on, right? So we all agree to a definition of structural racism, to a definition of racial equity, and to a definition of anti-Blackness, right? And we did an orientation before anyone was allowed to join that program, as we got a little further in the working group, not to exclude people, but to say, this is what this group is about, and you're entering into a group that has done a lot of work and learning together already. So we need you to be committed to these concepts as well, right? And if you're not, we're gonna help you with other learning, right? And give you resources and connect you to people, but this might not be the right space for you yet, right? And so being clear on like what your group, whatever that is, a foundation, an organization, a subcommittee, you know, what it's about, and being clear that people know that. And sometimes those, and then having clear ground rules as well. And when those ground rules are violated, right, how do you address that? And we did have a couple of situations where whiteness was being censored, right? And to this great question about white comfort, it's like, you know, people are so, I think in this, people want safety. They want a safe space to learn and to talk. And I've really moved away from this idea of a safe space, because when we talk about safety, you know, you need to ask safety for who, right? Like safety for like, you know, I'll be very blunt in saying for a white person to say something that might be problematic, and then for a people of color to kind of educate them or comfort them and make them feel not less bad about it. That's, I think, for many people, what they want in a safe space. Moving to think more about brave space, right? That, as to Nina's point, we all, no matter how long you've been doing this work and because of or despite of your lived experiences, we all have a lot of learning to do. And so we need to enter this space knowing that we are all still learning, that we're gonna make mistakes, that we might unintentionally hurt or harm someone. But in order for the work to happen, we need to bring bravery into the space and worry less about safety, right? And more about kind of the work at hand and really doing that hard work that is needed, that is oftentimes really uncomfortable.
So did you say move from a
color? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So did you say move from a safe space to a brave space? Is that what you said?
Move from this expectation of safe space, like to one of brave space, because often safe implies something for a certain, it's a white-centered idea, right?
Yeah,
white comfort. Yeah.
And Sarah, in the rest of her question, pointed that out too. She also wrote that she understands wanting to provide a learning environment, but doesn't that discount the real trauma and pain that people's racist comments and actions can cause? And maybe it's good to make people uncomfortable, because so many of our Black colleagues are uncomfortable every day because of our actions, policies, and racist society.
You know, I think
go ahead, Tamara. No, I was just saying, I went to a conference where someone started crying, talking about kind of their organization and kind of the trauma they had inflicted on people of color, right? Unintentionally, right? And then I was moved by, I mean, this woman was obviously really distraught about what had happened. And another white person said, can we just pause and name what's happening here? This is a session about learning about advancing racial justice. And now we've spent 5 minutes comforting you. Not that you don't need to be comforted by someone or in some space, but like we've now decentered the conversation from this other thing to, so like, it was just a really masterful way of naming it in a non-threatening, non-angry way, but like, let's name what's happening. So when you start seeing that happening, just take a moment, pause. Right? I think we're so into like keeping the agenda moving along, but if you keep doing that and you don't tend to those moments, right, then you're going to perpetuate like existing power structures and microaggressions and racist behavior. Tamara.
And the only thing I was going to add was, I was just going to say that I think that part of the power of the order of the series was having a conversation about white privilege, and led by a white woman. And she was able to put out all of these examples, many of them, of the ways in which that privilege is exhibited, and not having nothing, of course, to do with wealth, that it really is purely about the color of your skin and what privileges you have in society because of them. And one of them is for attention to be directed to you when the conversation becomes a conversation that is uncomfortable. And if these conversations were easy, perhaps we would have had them. So they aren't easy, but we have to keep at them, and we really have to dig deeply.
Yeah, yeah. And Nina, you had mentioned earlier that by participating in the series, you really got a vocabulary that you were lacking. And I also know that you wear a lot of different hats. So you're trustee of the Weisberg Foundation, but you're also CEO of your family's real estate company. And I know that you're involved in a lot of other organizations. Can you tell me a little bit, like, when you go into other organizations and you go into different places and wear these different hats, is maybe your vocabulary sometimes not matching up with other people's vocabulary?
Sure, yes. And one of the things that I think is in conversation right now in so many different places is this idea that identities are multiple. And I'm quoting here John Powell, although I think a lot of people have said it, and they're relational, right? And they're situational. So in terms of like intersectionality, we are in a lot of spaces and we wear different hats in those spaces. And so to the question about uncomfortable whiteness, which I fully believe, I also believe Tamara's comment that if people get shut down, and particularly if they're people in power, you don't get any movement. So you have to balance those two things. Can someone hear me? And am I being true to calling out racism, calling out these structures? Again, this really gave me the language to take into some of these other spaces, but not in the way we were able to talk about them in this room. And that was my light bulb example. That light bulb example is a very, very easy example to take into an academic board where 50% of the people may be highly conservative, don't truly believe in structural racism. Like, it's an easy first example in that conversation. So it's an easy way to introduce the language of racism and make it very broad and very big and depersonalized. So in that room, and this, we were talking about this on our preparation call, what roles do we play in this social change ecosystem? And this goes to the balancing of, we need to learn enough. We also need to empower the people who need to be speaking on their own behalf and not speaking for them, which I think is a big white woman issue, and I name it. And but we sometimes are in these rooms where other people may not be able to go. And so we are speaking on behalf of other people because they're not there. So taking their voice in, and in that room, I call it being a translator. Hanh and Tamara gave me the incredibly, I feel, flattering name of disruptor, which I'm sometimes called, but it's not intentional. So I'm on an academic board. I was on two, one of which was a fairly big board, and I would say things coming from these spaces in philanthropy that tended to seem extreme in that room that weren't extreme at all in the world of philanthropy or in the investment world. Whereas another place that I'm interacting a lot with the investment community or the real estate community, bringing some ideas of changing the frame of the conversation that might seem in that space disruptive. Whereas when I'm in the space with Hanh and Tamara, I'm certainly not the disruptor. I tend, to be the person that follows along or translates for or carries the voice of.
But
so I answered your question.
I think it's important to know which voices can people hear. Nina said she didn't remember how she got into the room about knowing about putting racism on the table, but I bet it was because she came to our annual meeting in 2015, where we had a speaker whose name was David Williams. He's a professor at Harvard, and the title of his presentation was "The House That Racism Built." And what we knew was that we needed someone who had the academic credentials, that people in that room would hear him. Because you hear philanthropy all the time saying they want to do work that's evidence-based. What does the data say? How do we know this is making a difference? And so when you had David Williams, who is a faculty, a tenured faculty member at Harvard in the School of Public Health and also in the Department of African American Studies, to do this presentation in just this matter-of-fact way that these people were able to hear him. And I think that it's also part of who's delivering the message and can that person be heard.
So maybe we can break into our breakout sessions. We're going to do some small groups. So each of the panelists will be in one breakout session, and DC ComNet leadership will also be in to help facilitate. But take a look at these roles. These are from Deepa Iyer, and I highly recommend that you look her up. I will send the information with all the other resources we've talked about today in an email after this webinar. This is a great way of thinking about all your roles in your life. They don't just have to be your roles at work. And think about how you can make change. We have a few questions we haven't gotten to yet in the chat, but some of them are around, how do you help reset the tone from the top if the tone from the top is that racial equity is a staff issue? And then there was another great question about, this is a moment of where people are being more receptive to hearing the message of racial equity. How can we take advantage of that as communicators? So I'd love for everybody to get into some great breakout groups and talk about their own roles and where they can see themselves in these systems and what they can do in them. And then we'll come back in a little bit. Welcome back. I know we were like just getting into the meat of the conversation when we had to break up, but I hope everyone was having a good time connecting and got some benefits. I want to thank David and Shanita for spending time with me. I want to do a time check because we are, lagging a little bit behind schedule. It's 6:26. We're scheduled to end at 6:30. We're about to talk with Hanh about, as an executive director, once you have done that work of learning and educating yourself and educating your peers, how do you transition into creating a strategy for your organization? And then how do you operationalize it? So I'd love to have that conversation and give it the time it's due. If people need to drop off the call, I will skip ahead super fast to just let you know. Oh, I wonder, Kareem, is everybody back with us or should I wait for a second?
Looks like everybody's back.
Okay, cool. I just want to share that, you seeing my PowerPoint presentation? So this is July. We're talking about racial equity. I just, when you walk away from this conversation today, I would love for you to think about something Hanh taught me, which is what, so what, now what? What did you hear? So what? What does that mean to you? And now what are you going to do with that information? And make a pledge to yourself. Make a pledge to yourself that you're going to watch the Putting Racism on the Table videos. Just pick one. Think about what you might do in your organization or in your other spheres of influence with your social roles. And in October, ComNetDC is making the pledge that we will reconvene on the issue of racial equity, sorry. And everybody here and all of their friends, all of their peers are invited to come back and let's talk about what that journey was like and support each other, because community is so important in this time. And if you want to pop in the chat that you're willing to be an accountability buddy, which is one of my favorite new words with anybody in this group, that's really the core and the heart of ComNet. I know I'm willing to be an accountability buddy. So I'll just put that out there and I'll put my email in. One other thing I want to make sure everyone catches, we will be sending in the resources, all of the things we've talked about today and additional resources, but I do want to let you know about this fantastic book that I have been reading. This is an amazing memoir by Tamara. It is about her life growing up in segregated Richmond and the friendships she had formed there, and then what life was like as she grew up and into adulthood and what those friendships were like. I'm not very far into it, I will be honest, but I love it. And I can't recommend, check it out, Daughters of the Dream. There's also a wonderful blog You can see that online at any time, and I just really encourage you to pick it up. I think it's going to be a really great August read for you. So for those of you who are willing to stick around a little bit past time, let's go back and talk about strategy and operation. Hanh, can you tell me a little bit? So we didn't really explain this yet. Putting Racism on the Table came out as a 2016 course of 6 courses, and then was brought back in 2018, and a new set of 6 courses came along. And then you were hired by the Weisberg Foundation also in 2018, is that right?
I came on at the end of the first series.
Oh, at the end of the first series.
Yeah, in May 2016, yeah.
Got it. So you sort of came in the middle of Nina's journey. And Nina, I want you to talk about this too. You took this work back to the Weisberg Foundation, and there was a incredibly big change made to your strategic planning. Can you both talk about strategy at the Weisberg Foundation, how you did that?
Yeah, so I will admit that the timing was perfect for the Weisberg Foundation, right? So the Weisberg Foundation had already started kind of thinking about kind of what's next, you know, first 30-ish years happened, social justice focus. What's next for the next 30 years, right, as the foundation continues to grow. Tamara launched Putting Racism on the Table at the RAG. Nina's like, oh, I want to be a part of this. And she started going to the series. And by the time I started at the foundation, there were only a couple of sessions left. And Nina's like, you need to come with me. And I'm like, of course, like, you know, like I definitely want to come. And one of my first tasks, like my first year at the foundation, was creating a strategic framework, a strategic plan for the organization. So I had, you know, a key trustee already bought in to understanding structural racism and understanding how racial equity is so critical to all the work that we were doing as a family foundation, a social justice foundation, right? We had a lot of the learning. We had a community of peers who also had been doing the work and were learning about the work. And then we had grantee partners and community members who have been waiting for philanthropy to center racial equity and support racial equity work, right? Particularly by communities of color or organizations led by people of color. So the timing was really, really fortunate for us. So we could really build this, right, from the ground up, based on what the foundation had already done in its first 30 years. And so I would say, you know, what was really important though for us was to be really, and to Tamara's point, naming structural racism and naming our desire to advance racial equity. And now we probably say more racial justice, right? But that intentionality and explicitness is really important for you internally to make sure that internally you're kind of speaking the same language and working towards the same goal, and that that's being projected outwardly as well. And then I would say one of the first things we did as a foundation as part of our strategic planning process is to articulate our values, right? And oftentimes people say we don't have value statements, we don't know what our values are. Your values are there, right? Like, you know what your values are. You're living those values, or like some of them are being operationalized and some of them are aspirational, but you know what they are, what you want them to be. So kind of coming to the same page on your values. We've since kind of updated our values language because we have even more clarity, right? And so our values now are listening and learning, building power and community, equity and justice. And so everything needs to be really driven by those values. They're also used as a touchstone to remind us what we're about. And they're also used as an accountability mechanism, right? Both internally and for grantee partners and other funders to say, if you have a value around listening and learning, like, you're doing more doing than listening right now, right? You need to check yourself. So I think it's important to be grounded in those values, and then to develop a really clear strategy. And for us as a foundation, a small foundation, funding is just one of 4 strategies we have, because we know with our $1.6 million that we're putting out a year, we're not going to make the change that we want to see in our community, in our region, and in philanthropy. So we do a lot of work. I mean, this is the communications network. We do a lot around amplification of the work that's happening, using our voice and our platform more. To Tamara's point, people listen to us because we're funders, for better or for worse, right? Because of power dynamics and power structures in our society. So let's have something important to say and try to move more people towards racial equity. We also do a lot of building a capacity, not just of our grantee partners, but of ourselves as a foundation, you know, continuing to learn and sharpen our analysis and understanding, and then building the capacity of philanthropy, right, to have a stronger racial equity analysis. And then we do a lot of collaboration and working with other funders, grantee partners, et cetera. So we have that clarity and strategy, like, this is how we're going to create change. And for us, change is that we want to be building power, right, in those communities that are most negatively impacted by racism, people of color, those closest to incarceration, immigrants and refugees. And then we have all these tactics, this like suite of things that we do. And as much as we need to have that strategic clarity, we need to have this flexibility with our tactics as we are continuing to learn as situations change. And this year is probably the biggest testament to why you need to have that tactical flexibility, you know, that, yeah, we had, you know, plans for what we were going to do in terms of grant making and programming. And when COVID hit, we had to readjust. We had to do we had to revisit our entire budget to things like what needs to change given the circumstances. So that flexibility is also really important. And I would say, and this has come up a little bit, maybe explicitly or implicitly throughout the conversation, through all of us need to be aware of power, right? And at a RAG annual meeting, probably a couple of years ago, Tamara brought in Eric Liu, and he's the founder of Citizen University. And he said something that has always stuck with me. He said there are 3 laws of power, right? One is that power self-justifies, right? The more power we have as individuals or institutions, the more we're like, I deserve this power. I worked really hard for this power, right? So you're going to self-justify. Power also pools and concentrates. The more power you have, the more power you get, right? And those are kind of, could be negative, like perceptions of power. Not always, depends on how you use it, but it can be negative things. But the third law of power was really revelatory to me, and that's that power is infinite. It can be created, right? And so like when we understand that, both in like those of us who have traditional power and those of us who don't have positional or traditional power or societal political power, power can be created. So we all have power, regardless of whatever, you know, positions we sit in organizations or in our community. And we all can build and share power as well, right? So we don't have to hoard it, right? We can like, someone else having power does not mean we have to have less power, right? And so that's been really important to this work, is this power awareness. And then I would just speak to this ongoing internal work. Like at this point at the foundation, we are doing a lot, but we are continuing to learn. You know, on the Weisberg Foundation board, we made a commitment this year to learning, to really deeply understanding and operationalizing better what it means to be an anti-racist organization, you know? And so all of our trustees have been tasked, and we're helping them with doing like individual learning on racial equity, because everyone's in a different place in their learning journey. Everyone has different identities and intersectional identities. And so like do some learning on your own, and then we'll also continue to do some group learning as well, because we need to move forward both as individuals and as a group. And then I will say the last thing that's so important in kind of this, there's the question around like, how do you sustain authentic commitment to racial justice? Kind of like what we're doing here, you have to be really transparent and honest with yourself and with others in terms of where you are and what you're doing. And because this work can be really messy is probably a really privilege to say it. Messy, it can be harmful, it can be traumatic, right? And so you need to be really transparent. And I get asked to speak a lot about like the Weisberg Foundation, our racial equity work. And I say, I'm not sharing this because I'm an expert and we're perfect at it at the Weisberg Foundation. We're sharing it because we want to share a truthful story of a journey that one foundation has taken, and to share what we've learned in the hopes that it might help others learn and move a little further in their journey as well.
Yeah, Shanita put in there that also wanting to know about power and it being redistributed. She feels like power needs to be redistributed because it can be created, but not always. Is there any experience at the Weisberg Foundation or that any of you can speak to about that?
I'll share. I'm a big fan of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy's Power Moves guide, and we as a foundation went through like a year-long process of working through power moves to assess how we're building, sharing, and wielding power. I also think seeding power should be kind of like a fourth dimension of power moves. And so there has been conversation about that. And I'll say it's hard, right? Like, how do you do that in a way that is genuine and authentic? And we still have conversations about that. Even today, I had a conversation with one of our trustees about it. Some of it is aspirational, some of it is operationalized. Some of the things that we've been doing are built, you know, kind of thinking about at all levels of our organization, from our board and governance structure and how we operate, to operations and how we hire and how we write job descriptions, right? how we lead staff meetings, all the way through our programming and communications, thinking about like how we are sharing, building, and wielding our power, and more ceding power to advance racial equity. But it is easier said than done. That's the reality. I think any of us who like are in positions where we are in charge of something, even delegating, right? Like that's kind of a form of ceding power that's hard for us as individuals to do. So kind of bake that into philanthropy and the systems that we're working in. Yeah, it can be daunting.
I'm so sad that we only have an hour together, because the Weisberg Foundation is an amazing case study in this kind of work, in being strategic, in being flexible, and in operationalizing. I mean, if you think of the timeline that they have been through, you know, from January to June of 2016, Nina attended Putting Racism on the Table courses. In August of 2016, Hanh joined the foundation, and or May you joined, and then in August, that summer, you kicked off a strategic planning process around racial equity. Fast forward to November 2016 in the presidential election, and you know, the work you were doing in creating a strategic plan was suddenly even more important to you. And at that time, the Weisberg Foundation said they realized that they needed a bolder process, a bolder plan and strategy to advance racial equity. You know, a year later, that framework was released and it's shared, and that is available to all of us today. We will share that in the resources. November 2018 to June 19, though, the work wasn't done. And I know that you participated in the Power Moves curriculum, which we'll also share. And by November 2019, you were revising that strategic plan again. So like authentic work, you kept learning. Sustained work, you kept checking in and making changes all along the way. The Weisberg Foundation has been incredibly transparent in sharing what that process has been like and the steps you've taken. And the work isn't done from what I hear. You're still making plans. You're still learning and adjusting. Yeah, Nina.
If I could just close, because I know we are out of time. There's so much I'd like to share with all of you in terms of this process, but I think it's really important to say that my sister who's on this call and our father who founded the foundation, we'd spent, you know, the better part of 25 years arguing about what was poverty, how was poverty created. We had one person on the board who was a minister who'd left the church, who was deeply embedded in community. And so when we came to that strategic plan with Tamara's Putting Racism on the Table, the first 6 months at our back, and Han's incredible leadership, we were able to give a name and start to frame things that we'd been doing for a long time, but we didn't understand what the name was. And naming it allowed us to go into it much more deeply, and as both Han and you have said, much more intentionally. But it wasn't a dramatic shift. And I want to say that not because I want to undermine Han, because I think she's been a brilliant leader for us, but because I actually want to lift up my father on this call and my sister and these incredible original group of board members. And the work that they did, we fought around the table about language in a lovely way. We questioned each other, we challenged each other. And so when Tamara and Han came in and these other entities and started to challenge us even more, we were not there, and we're still not there, but we were a little bit opened and ready. I don't want anyone to think it was just me. It was a large group of others, and education in a lot of ways. So
yeah, thank you.
Tip to the people who were on the board with me then.
Yeah. And thank you to your father. Thank you to your sister. Is that you, Wesley? Thank you for joining us tonight. Also, I love your Zoom picture because I keep thinking you're actually using your camera. It's brilliant. I'm going to adopt that for some work meetings. Andrew Sherry, I really want to thank you for dropping this resource in the chat about the Knight Foundation and about if you're at a big foundation, here's a way you can redistribute power, which was Shanita's point. So thank you so much for including that. That's not one we had looked at. Tamara, Nina, Han, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all of you for staying along with us. I hope we'll see you all back in October. We will be sharing, let's see, contact information. If you have follow-up questions, we'll post that for you. It's like the last piece I didn't have queued up. There you go. And we're here at ComNetworkDC to help everybody in this. We're all in this together. We all want to do better. We all want to make the world a better place. I look forward to sending out an email after this video has been processed, and you can share it with your colleagues and your friends and your family, all free of charge. And we'll make sure all these resources are at your fingertips. So thanks everybody so much for your time. It was really wonderful to spend the evening with you.
Bye.
You well.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tamara.